Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Are we all good? Okay. My name's Peter Osella. I'm Assistant Superintendent here at Lowell National Historical Park. This is the session on Lowell's Revitalization, Historic Preservation as Economic Development. Our speakers here today include Jim Cook, who is the Executive Director of the Lowell Development Financial Corporation, which is a nonprofit banking group, and also the executive director of the Lowell Plan, which is a nonprofit business group, who have been, both of whom have been very active in Lowell since the 70s. Jim is a Northeastern University grad, and he's been with the, he was with the City Planning and Development Office. Actually, he was my assistant for a short while when I was at the City Planning and Development Office, but Jim has been now with the Lowell Plan and LDFC for 27 years. And next to him is Diane Trad, who has a degree from UMass Amherst in environmental design. She is currently the Assistant City Manager for Planning and Development, and she has been with the Planning and Development Department of City Hall for 25 years. And I was Planning and Development Director, let's see, 1984, some 33 years ago, some awful long time ago, left there to run a federal agency that was existed in Lowell for 17 years called the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission. It was a partner agency to the National Park that was doing the development. The National Park was doing exhibits. The Lowell Historic Preservation Commission was creating the trolley line, the boat, boat operations, doing historic preservation, setting the standard for preservation, and developing a few projects of its own. In 1995, I came over to Lowell National Historical Park as Assistant Superintendent for Development, where I have been ever since. So, without further ado, my job here is to walk you through some images, give you the overview of Lowell. You will not have multiple PowerPoints. We won't kill you with PowerPoints. I'll kill you with my PowerPoint, and then they will talk. So, let's see here. So just to, okay, that's not encouraging. There we go. So Lowell, many of you know, textile industry, I will say in here, birthplace of American Industrial Revolution. There are plenty of folks around the country who would debate that, but I'm not going to get into it. Lowell's architecture was mostly utilitarian. I mean, this was mill production. We had a few architecturally attractive buildings, but they were really mostly built with a utilitarian basis. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, urban renewal, the mills had declined, this desire to get something new without really knowing what that was. If any of you know anything about urban renewal, it's like, oh, the great things are coming. We just have to get rid of what's here now, and then we'll figure it out. So we also had the photo on the right is the 1987 fire. So in the course of the decades, changes do happen. This photo is from an article in the newspaper recounting a study by MIT students who said if we could only take down enough buildings to create 6,000 parking spaces downtown, it would support the retail. So thank God we didn't do it. So urban renewal, what do we get? Low-rise concrete buildings, and then things got better. We got high-rise concrete buildings. And so we still have these buildings. But the fellow on the left there is Dr. Patrick Mogan. He was a superintendent of schools, but he was an advocate. He viewed the city as a classroom. He actually went out and got some HUD funding and had a study done and hired historians to say what was in Lowell's history that the public didn't know about that would be important. And a lot of people, so people did not know about what was first here, what was innovative here, what was special here. And then the photo on the right, Paul Songus on the right was the lead author of the legislation that created Lowell National Historical Park. That's Jimmy Carter at the signing of the legislation. So within a couple, that was 1978. So 1980 was the first preservation plan. So that in itself is an interesting thing, that with the National Park and the Preservation Commission coming into the community, having a preservation plan that said, here are the goals, here's what we want to do. There's actually another book that's called Details of the Preservation Plan, which rates and inventories every single building within the preservation district, historic and not historic, which is a reference tool we all use to this day. The boundary map over there, the darkest areas and the areas sort of snaking out to the sides, that is the boundary of the national park. By the way, most people in Lowell don't know where the boundary of the national park is, and it kind of doesn't matter. So that is the zone where the park has certain authorities and powers to do activities, maybe own a building, whatever, that they can't do in other places. The lighter zone right around the dark green zone is the preservation district. So Congress actually created a buffer zone around the national park because it's the critical mass of the buildings. It's keeping the critical mass intact that we spend a lot of time doing. So just very quickly, we have our, for those of you unfamiliar with Lowell, we have our trolley visitor transportation system. So we're moving people from a central visitor parking lot through parts of the downtown on rail. Lowell had a streetcar system at the turn of the century. There's a turn of the century replica. We have boats that take people on canal tours, and many of you will be on tours today that include the boats. And again, I imagine Jim mentioned that we're going to have boats running along that route at lunchtime. So if you just want to take your lunch, get on a boat, and 20, 25 minutes, just a short run. A lot of the focus is on the textile history, the looms. This is our boot mill museum. That's our river transformed exhibit at the Suffolk Mill. We have a visitor center at the market mills. So let's see. So here, so what we have is a reasonably intact downtown. Certainly where urban renewal hit, we lost a lot. But when you look at the downtown, you see buildings close together. You don't see large numbers of surface parking lots. And I can tell you that when you do walk around the downtown, you see a surface parking lot. Nowadays, there are developers talking about developing those lots. And that was not something that happened over the last 40 years. And they weren't lining up to do that like they are now. And I want to tell you about this because the Lowell Historic Board is the city's design review agency. So it is not a Chapter 40C, it is special legislation. So for example, it can vote to deny demolition. So it's a slightly stronger thing. It can issue penalties, et cetera. Its membership includes the Assistant City Manager for Planning and Development, representative of the Park Service, Lowell Historical Society, Mass Department of Conservation Recreation, Boston Society of Architects, the Bar Association, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Planning Board. So it's a very interesting group of people who bring a lot of different skills to that. But I think that as we go through some of these slides very quickly, it is as much the regulatory process, the rules put in place, the standards, and tracking the little items from day to day. They're just as important as the big multi-million-dollar redevelopments that really do transform the city, because it's that accumulation of little things that will get you. So you can get the gist here of the change that happened over the last 40 years. I love this one because somebody had to put that metal screen up over that pesky brick and granite and paint the top So just astounding that somebody would do that to modernize the building.
I think it was a good idea.
This is an interesting one because the building, in the left photo, that building, somebody put on that blue and red paneling, and when it came off, there was actually nothing underneath. So historically, there had been essentially a molded copper facade on there, which was restored to the building, so added back on. But you just wonder how things got as bad as they did. Here is one of our main retail buildings downtown. Again, totally whitewashed. This was a Jordan Marsh department store. Great story, great role of the Lowell Development Financial Corporation Lowell plan. If we want to talk about a case study, the Bon Marché might be a good one. And this is my favorite of all, because when I came to Lowell, I looked at that view on the left and I said, we will renovate every building in this town, and that will look exactly like that. Until a 75-year-old priest came in to see me and said, I want to renovate that. I want to create a retirement home for priests from the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. It'll be a retirement home for priests because then I will have volunteers to help me keep the church open. The church is around the corner. But they did a phenomenal job. The national park, when the national park was created, we brought in a lot of architectural students to do renderings of what certain buildings would look like if restored. Because when you look at that thing on the left, how would you even know where to begin? But we knew where to begin, so when he asked the question and got involved with it, we were ready to go. I haven't figured out how to make that stop. Cherry Web Terrain was a downtown department store. When the developers acquired this building, we said, well, what's under the skin? And they said, we don't know. I said, how could you not know? Why don't you just open one of the windows and reach out and feel it? Well, it turns out all the windows were cinder blocked. So from the inside, there was no outside. So they had to take out the cinder blocks and repair the facade. It was a terracotta facade, and it's used at our employment and training. The city's employment and training programs are in there. There are a number of cases where private developers have done projects, but the city has really helped out by taking city programs that might otherwise rent space somewhere else and put them, in buildings that will help facilitate the rehab. This is one that's still going on. So looking at the upper photo there, this building got pretty well wrecked over the years. What happened was a developer wanted the building behind it to come down for a parking lot, said he would rehab the building, realized he could not financially do it, and many millions of dollars later, I can assure you he was right. And we got into a whole big fight about demolishing the building. Paul Songus actually refereed, had us both come into the planning and development conference room, and he said, "You're both my friends, I want you to work it out." And the developer said, "I don't want to fight anymore." But by the way, the Lowell Sun had editorialized in favor of demolition. What will it ever be? We don't know what it'll be. Better to take it down. That would have killed that entire section of the downtown because the view behind it would have been awful, and the developer only wanted to expand his parking lot. The developer came to the meeting and said, "I'll give you the building. I don't want to pay the taxes. I don't want to pay the insurance. I'll give you the building," which was a real choke point for me. But we did, in fact, this was the former Lowell Historic Preservation Commission, did actually accept the building and spent, in the course of 2 decades, about $2 million to restore the parapets, the towers. The towers are actually federal highway grants. Under transportation enhancements. That's how we got the towers funded. Rebuild the first floor facade of granite and brick, which had come out. So then we surplused the building to GSA because we had no use for the building. They put it on the market, and I don't know if you're aware, but when excess federal property is out there, if federal agencies don't want it, and state agencies, there are special programs for health care, education, in some other category. Middlesex Community College came in and they got it for $1. And right now, they're spending $20 million inside that building to create their Performing Arts Center, which should be open in the next 6 or 8 months. So this is a case, I want to mention that there's some new construction going on. So in the lower photo, you can see that there was a one-level ruin of a building, of a mill-style building, which was a place where hydraulic experiments were done by James B. Francis, who's the founder of, the inventor of a lot of things on our canal system. So the question was, that was structurally unsound, so that actually came out, this with the involvement of Mass Historical Commission. This was owned by DCR, state, and DCAM put out an RFP to developers. We participated in that. We got a developer. The historic board worked to help define how that first floor should look, but allow a taller building. Historically, there had been a taller building here, so there was a precedent for it. We're very happy with that addition to the historic district. And this is brand new, just opened in the last month or so. It's a privately financed college dorm. So it's a private development, $40 million, and you can see in the photo up above, there was a mill in that location once upon a time that had a tower. So with the modern change up, but we did encourage them to have a tower in that location. There's actually a vista down one of the canals toward that tower historically, and now the new tower. So very quickly, I just wanted to talk about landscape and infrastructure, because I don't want you to think it's all about buildings only. It's about the character of the community. And back in 1985, a group of us put together a Canalway task force, because we have 5.5 miles of canals, much of which is downtown, much of which did not have public access. So, and I won't go through the status of each of them, but we've got probably 75% of it built out now. Over the years, we have managed to generate $54 million to do that construction, much of which in the early days was Department of Interior appropriations, but later on became Department of Transportation. So we've done a lot Department of Transportation, competing in various programs and getting earmarks when they were available. And then, so you can just see some of these areas. This is right outside, the upper left is right outside the back of the hotel. That's where you'll be boarding the boats for any of you on those tours. But again, it really enhances the character of the community. The canals are there. The idea is to give public access, and we put in interpretive wayside so people can know more about them. This is one that the government did itself. So this is a federal acquisition of an old well, this was a boarding house, so you can see we restored it to what it once was, so having to reconstruct the upper floors. There are several Park Service exhibits in there, and then we acquired the parking lot and created a outdoor performing arts park, and this is just a view of it during concerts. Public art has been important. Back in the 90s, Paul Tsongas chaired the Lowell Public Art Committee. That made a hell of a difference in terms of whether things got done in elevating the quality of what got done and getting the corporate sponsorship to get it done. So there were a lot of us who worked on a lot of these pieces. There's a story behind every one of these. And then 9 years of my life went into getting rid of 16 billboards from the downtown, because again, it's the visual clutter that accumulates that can hurt you. So with the improvements of the buildings and the removal of the billboards was a big help. Again, you heard during the introduction about the mills. Looking again at an aerial, you can see how close, how the city is built. There's not a lot of open space. The mills are Many of the mills are intact, so we have 5.3 million square feet in this downtown. We're now at 98%. We've got, that's with two that are well under construction and not quite done, but they're going to be done. And here's an early one, 1982, Market Mills on the left. The upper floors had had a fire. On the lower left, you can see the courtyard was just a congested mess. The building did get historic preservation tax credits and probably would not, or at least, let me rephrase that. I don't believe it got, it had a number of bits of federal funding in it. I don't believe it would secure tax credits today. I think that might be a better way of putting it. But that was the state of the art in 1982. And then here's, that by the way was, and by the way, in 1982 in this downtown, what we got was low-income housing, low-income family housing, low-income elderly housing. The economy was not very strong. It wasn't going to support other market rate uses. Here's in 1984 and later, Wanalancet Mill, which is the left half, or about half of the mill is office and technology spaces, which are fully, or very close to fully occupied. In fact, Jim's office is in there. And the part on the sort of upper side, the right, is owned by the University of Massachusetts, and they have their planning and accounts, sort of back office operations there. Very nice space. This is the boot mill. Some of you who are joining me on tours later or other tours later might end up at the boot mill. Here, in the course of a couple of decades, we've seen $117 million worth of investment. 15 million of that is the National Park Service Museum, which is this one over here. But the rest of it is all market rate housing. There's some condos, but mostly it's rental housing. These are tax credit projects, and we're very proud of the quality of the market rate housing that's in there. Well, here's some interior shots of the public areas and one of the units. This is an interesting one because it's the buildings in the center were done in the mid-'80s, about 300 units of market rate housing. The building, the so-called Picker building in the back here was just completed. However, a portion of it on the end was allowed to be demolished. So both we allowed it, and on appeal, the tax credit folks in Washington approved it, and it did get state tax credits as well, because there was a need for fire access there. Not just that the buildings were so close to the other occupied buildings, but that there's a building way in the back there. You see the smokestack? There's another building in the back, and I think I have another. Here we go. So that's the same complex. Here's the buildings on an L up there. This is the Picker building. This piece has come out, and this is to be done. And that's going to, completion of that next phase, which we're hopeful for. It's not committed, it's not financed yet, although they've accumulated quite a bit of tax credit commitments from the state. That commitment, that project will bring us over 99% of our mill space downtown. And then just to give you a sense of the size of the other mill complexes, so here, 69 million there, and there was some smaller buildings, so 79, $80 million has been spent over time. Again, all private, so anything I'm not telling you was a government project was privately financed. So I just want to be sure you understand. So when we talk about funding that came in for the national park, it's for national park facilities for the most part. It's not for paying to subsidize the private sector. State and federal tax credits do that, and they may have other sources, but not the appropriations that came to the Lowell National Park. They're for national park facilities. And this is an amazing project, the Lowell Community Health Center, $42 million in the first phase, Just the interior there, that's just the lobby shots, because most of it is, health center kinds of exam rooms and whatnot. Just an amazing thing that was done in the last couple of years. And now they're working on phase 2, which is under construction, $27 million there. So they'll have 200,000 square feet for a local community health center. It's phenomenal. And I think everybody's blown away by this facility. And right next to that is Counting House Lofts, just completed, $36 million, and adding lofts next to it, about 130 market rate units. Across the street, Mill number 5. This is the most improbable of all. It is a shopping mall kind of place on the 4th floor of a mill. And when I heard about this, I said, well, that'll last about a week, and I was wrong. It is the coolest place in Lowell. So Coffee and Cotton is a very popular coffee house. Luna Theater is a, arts space. That's the building there on the right. It's being done little by little. That is not a tax credit project. The developer is kind of doing it out of his own pocket, little bit at a time. Here we have the Hamilton Canal District, and I'm going to wrap up now. This is the city's priority future development site. I think Diane wants to talk about it some more, so I might keep the slide up there after, get it back up again. We have, the state is doing a trial court facility, and you're going to see a picture of that in a minute, but notice the waterways all around this. So as the city has planned this area, it has integrated the concepts of the canalway. These were not necessarily areas where our canalway walkways were planned. We already had one over here, the Swamp Locks area, and we had hopes for one over here, which is now there thanks to the city taking it on. But all of this down in here is going to be new. So there'll be a lot of new construction. The first thing the city did in doing this master plan was identify the historic resources, and the Appleton Mill right here was the first thing done, and what is now known as 110 Canal. And let me show you the Appleton. The Appleton was in tough shape, and in case you can't see it, these are the floors caving in one to the other. That's how bad this was. If there was ever a mill in this town that the National Park would have supported for demolition, this is it. I give big credit to Trinity Financial, who was the developer of this project, because they did not shrink from the challenge. It's a $65 million development, and it's 136 artist live-work spaces. So it is not exactly high-end housing. They figured out how to put those finances together. Very definitely includes federal historic tax credits, state historic tax credits, new markets tax credits, everything under the sun, probably some low-income housing tax credits. I know they sold $42 million in tax credits to MetLife, and the MetLife people were thrilled. So they basically took the credits, sold them to MetLife. That gave them cash to put into the project. So tremendous project. This is 110 Canal Street, and the before and the after, most people stare at it and say, how can they be the same building? Because you can see somebody put in, closed up the bigger windows that used to be here and put in, windows you'd have in your house. This is now high-tech R&D space. The university innovation hub has taken over the top couple of floors, and that's continuing to fill up with R&D. And my final slide is, this is the Lowell trial court. So I give credit. This is a Feingold Alexander design. It's under construction right now. It's up to about 5 stories out of 7 out there, the steel. It's on the canal. It's granite and glass. I think Feingold Alexander did a great job for DCAM, so as a state agency. It's going to be huge. It is a large building, but I think it's a great project. That's your tour of Lowell. Now, you're going to hear about some of the financing incentives that are available from Jim Cook of the Lowell Development Financial Corporation and the Lowell Plan. And I will get your website up here, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Peter mentioned in my introduction, I've been at the Lowell Plan / Lowell Development Financial Corporation for the last 27 years. And prior to that, I had spent 13 years in the Planning and Development Office in the city. And in fact, I was born in the city and have actually never lived anywhere else. I don't say that as a boast. I say that to let you know that I completely lack any perspective of what other communities have done since I've lived through all of this. And my goal when I was 17 was to leave the city, was to leave Lowell. So you can see how successful I was with that. But this is a far different city than the one I grew up in. And what's interesting is that, Peter obviously is with the National Park and has talked about the legislation that was created and the passage of that legislation in June of 1978 and the importance that had on the city of Lowell. But as somebody that grew up here, whose friends, family, neighbors, relatives were all here in the city, that didn't mean a whole lot to us. Because now you're telling us that a building that we may have looked at all our lives is historical. That canals that people actually grew up jumping in and swimming in are now part of Lowell's history. So while a part of us understood what that meant, another part was, what is the big deal? And so what we've had to do as a community, and what we've tried to do both as a consortium of banks and as a group of business people is try to understand how is that going to work for us. So if I could just circle back to 1975, the idea of a Lowell Development Corporation was created, a consortium of banks, if you will, because at the time, downtown Lowell specifically was very unofficially redlined. And do you all know what redlining means? Banks don't want to lend money in that area. They can't say they won't, but as an unofficial policy, they didn't want to lend money in the downtown. So the idea that then Congressman Paul Tsongas had, and a fellow banker named George Duncan, who's still heading up a bank in Lowell, the idea they had was that, well, what if the banks pooled their money, and then if they made a loan and there were 7, 8, 9 banks in that pool, they would each only have 1/9 of the loan. So their risk is minimized. The loan could be made at a cheaper rate, which at the time was going to be 40% of prime. And for those of you, it looks like a lot of you are very young, but at that time, prime was like 14, 15, 16%. So a rate of 40% of prime and the banks not having full exposure on a loan became a very attractive idea. So the LDC started with the intent of making some loans in the downtown to get some of the buildings fixed up. And since then, and we were created by an act of the state legislature, but since then, we have expanded to include the geographical boundaries, if you will, of the city of Lowell. Again, we're not very regional because we're made up of a lot of the Lowell banks, but we've been replaced, some of them have been replaced by some of the bigger regional banks. But we still, our focus is to lend money to incentivize development in Lowell. So we do everything from lending down payment assistance to first-time home buyers, which we lend money out at 0 interest. You can get 50% of your down payment up to a maximum of $5,000, and you don't have to pay right away. You have 5 years before the first payment is due. And so it becomes very attractive for people that want to buy a home, and it's not limited to any part of Lowell, it's geographically within the city. So it's become a good incentive for people that had not saved much money, or rather had saved some money but need to do some rehab or want to do some other expenses related to buying a house. And that program has become fairly successful. We've done almost 600 of those. Just before I go any further, I want to introduce my partner and colleague, Jermaine Vision Trudell, who's here, and she's worked with me. Actually, I got there in 1990, leaving the Planning and Development Office to go to work at the Lowell Plan in the LDC. And she's been there since 1986. I think she was about 11 when she started there. But she's been there a lot longer and will be available if anybody wants to ask questions about the details. But let me just get back to the 70s. So the LDC was started with that principle that the banks would lend money, but through a pool. They created this organization, and we were off and running. So how can we play a role with the national park? How can we play a role with historic preservation? Because quite honestly, as I mentioned earlier, people couldn't find a way into it. What was the idea? We understood from a national park point of view, from a history point of view, why it made sense. But developers are going to buy buildings and fix them up have to know one very specific thing. Can they make money here? How can this be a lucrative venture? Because they're not going to do it just to restore a building and walk away. We felt we needed to show them how this can be turned into a money-making venture. So the National Park tag, if you will, for the city of Lowell, gave us a name, put us in places that we had not been before. And Lowell's always had to fight a perception issue about what it's done and what it can do and what Lowell is as a community. And we're still fighting that even after all these years today. We're still fighting the perception that we're this old mill town, et cetera, because that in itself didn't have a very sexy connotation. So we had to find a way to empower and, if you will, to attract developers into our city to buy buildings and, more importantly, restore them. So the slides that Peter showed you are great examples of historic preservation, but every one of them had to be driven by a developer and how can they make money. And I'm not talking about the buildings the Park Service owns and runs and they function with, but the buildings that are going to have tenants, the buildings that are going to have to support themselves and support debt on those buildings. So what we did is working with the National Park Service, and they had created a set of standards to restore the buildings. We put packages together that would provide some attractive financing. And so we again, working since 1975, the idea was to create enough of an incentive that people would want to borrow this money through this consortium called the LDFC. They would do it at reduced interest rates, but it would not be 100% of the financing. We would be in second place. The reason being twofold. One is that we don't want to compete with the banks that are out there lending money on their own, and we don't want to replace them because they're funding us. That didn't seem to make any sense. But if we provided a second mortgage on the property, it would not be anything that the banks would be at risk for, because we would be behind them. And it would provide equity that the borrower, or less equity that the borrower would need to provide to the bank. So it seemed to be a good target to shoot for, and we did, and we've done just a lot of those, and I think as you've seen in some of the slides, those are the type of things that we found could attract developers. And again, it had to be a sale because you had to find out why developers would want to do these properties over. And the idea of historic preservation, again, being a somewhat attractive one, only becomes attractive if there are enough incentives to do it, because historic preservation can be a very costly thing. To do these buildings over the way we've done them, the way the private developers have done them, and to the meticulous detail that they've had to do and conform with the Park Service standards, requires a good infusion of cash. So, and you need tenants, again, to support that. You can't have a pretty building that's empty because it's going to quickly be foreclosed on and deteriorate. And what have you got? You've got what happened in Lowell in the 40s and 50s. So we had to find a blend or a mix of tenants, if you will. So that's one of the programs that we created to attract developers to buy and fix up and restore property. Another program that we have, and Peter, I apologize for jumping all over, but one of the things we created, the city came to us with an idea back about 20 years ago, 17, 18 years ago, that if we're going to put retail in our downtown, and we're going to be very serious about growing retail, we're going to fund retail. Who wants to fund startup retailers? Well, the answer there is virtually nobody, because they're all at risk. And you can't walk into a bank, however community-oriented the bank is, and say, I have an idea, I want to start this thing up. You're probably not going to get financing. So with some incentive from the city using their community development block grant program, we took some of that money and then went back to the banks and raised over the last, another $3 or $4 million of bank money to grow and start retail, so we can actually put them in these buildings so they can actually support debt that these buildings have incurred. And we could, as I said, really grow our own retail. And we've done about 35 of those to date. We're currently working with 3 more that we have queued up to open up in the next couple of months. And the program has probably seen about 20 to 26 of those are still active and still work, which is far better than what a national trend would tell you. And some of those, as I say, are still here operating and doing very well. Some of those are now currently looking to expand in other communities. So the idea was put your money where your mouth is. If you're serious about doing something in your downtown, which works in partnership with historic preservation, how do you put tenants in the buildings? Well, you got to finance them. You got to find ways to do that, and you got to be creative. And again, working with the city and the idea they had, it became a fairly easy thing to do. Once we had our history behind us, we could then go back to the banks on any new idea, because they knew how we worked, they knew how we functioned, and we had a long track record. And so getting them to fund ideas became a fairly simple thing. Another program we started about a year and a half ago was called the Launch in Lowell program. And what we're doing there is taking the same idea as the venture fund. Instead of growing retail, we're growing companies. And we're working with the university in their hub because, again, you have these mill buildings, you have these properties in our downtown and other places. So how do you put tenants in? How do you grow tenants in there? So working with the university's innovation hub and center, we create a program where we will fund a startup company to go in there and grow jobs. What we don't want to be is a Shark Tank. I do not want to be picking winners and losers from a group. It's not my background, it's certainly not my skill, but we rely on the universities, the people that run the Innovation Center, to come back and tell us, this is a great idea, they're ready to go, they're not. So relying on their expertise, we just started this program about a year ago. We've already funded 3 or 4 of them, and again, with a couple more in the queue. We have some people that have created something called Invisaware, which is going to be jewelry that has a button on it, and when you hit that button, if, God forbid, you're somewhere in a situation that's hostile or you're being attacked, you can hit that button, and rather than have to reach for a cell phone and dial a number, that button could reach as many as up to 10 different organizations, whether it's the 911, police department, friends, family, and
Can you give the website address? Because folks, we're doing this so that you can know what's on the website and go there yourself.
okay. All of these programs we're talking about is on ldfc.org. So if anybody wants to follow up, I also, Jermaine has some brochures with her and has our cards in it if anybody at any point wants to call and follow up as to how we did these and how they can maybe work in your community. We'd be happy to help you. As long as your community is not next door to us and you're trying to take tenants away from us, then we wouldn't help you. But otherwise, we're we've seen Lawrence actually, as a community, try to and successfully 2 years ago create very similar organizations and try to do the same thing there. Because for me, it makes nothing but sense. I can't understand why any community, and every community has banks in their communities, why they wouldn't do the same thing. There's no downside, and it just seems like a logical approach to take. So anyway, so we're funding these startup companies, and they're going into these mill properties, and they're taking space, and hopefully will go into manufacturing at some point, grow jobs, fill these mill buildings. There are 2 tenants already in the boot mills, Pete, that are hopefully going to grow, expand, and again, bring us back to where we came from, which is to create manufacturing jobs in mill spaces. And what's amazing in all these cases is that I'm 63. I probably look a lot older than that, but I'm not. But the people that are coming through this program just graduated from college. They're 21, 22. They've got these fantastic ideas. They're off and running. We're funding them. And these people are going to be successes at a very young age, and it's great to see. So for us, this relationship we have with the university has been something that's been pretty spectacular and something that we really started to take advantage of more and more, including the last couple of years. So if I could just skip over a couple of other programs, because again, I don't want, some of this can be very dull and repetitive, if not everything I've already said is. But in the energy, we also have energy loans, which the city, and Diane maybe can tell you about, but the energy loans came out of an idea the city had and a grant the city had. Again, what we do is we take a grant that the city has, and we ask them to turn the grant money, or in part, some of that, over to us, and then we will use that and leverage 5, 6, 7 times the amount of private bank funds. And the reason, and Diane can explain this too, but the reason it makes sense to do this through a nonprofit like the LDFC is because if you're a borrower and you want to come and borrow money, you're filling out financial forms, you're giving us tax returns, you're giving us all the things that you would give any lender. We have that information. Coming to us, that information is very private and confidential. If you went to the city to borrow money, it's not, it's a public document. Who wants their financials to be a public document? That's a disincentive, if you will, to do that. And back in 30 years ago or so, when the city first got its first urban development action grant, the idea was how do you take that $5 million the city got to locate a large tech company and put their headquarters here in the city, and how can you then lend that to the developer and have the city recapture that money? In effect, the city council for the city of Lowell would become, they would be the lender, and as the money is paid back, what do you do with the money? What do you use it for? And the city council would then, in effect, be the loan officers. And I worked for the city at that time. That would have been a major disaster if the city council, and I'm looking out there are no Lowell city councils in this audience, right? But anyway, if that had happened and the money stayed with the city, then the city council would be making loans, or that would be again a terrible proposition, because even banks don't do that as successfully as they like. But then you would have the city saying, well, wait a minute, teachers need more money, we need more police, we need more firemen, we need to fix our streets. In my mind, that money would have been dissipated in 3 years, never seen again. By having it come over to us, we're still using that money. It's revolving. HUD had declared it to be not any longer federal dollars once the initial loan was made. So we can continually lend that money out, 40 years later, and still see the benefits and still reap the awards. And that's something that, and Peter both when he was assistant city manager and Diane. And when I was there, we always understood that that vehicle of the Lowell Development Financial Corporation really can be a major plus or an asset to the city, because it can do things quicker, it can do things in a more business-like way, and that's not to detract from what the city does. They have a range of things they have to deal with. But it made it very simple, and it makes it easier for borrowers, again, to come in and look to borrow money when they're not sitting at City Hall or sitting in front of a city council asking them for a loan. So if I could just quickly shift, and I make sure our timing is good, because we want to not only that you hear from Diane, but answer as many questions as any of you may have. But the Lowell plan was started in 1980 as an idea to get business people to sit around the table. I'm not sure you need this on a slide, Pete. I'll just talk about it. I'm not looking at anything he's doing. Is anything he's doing coinciding with anything I'm talking about? Disregard that. Again, we have folders here. You can go on lowellplan.org or ldfc.org and find out in better detail anything I'm talking about. But the idea for the Lowell plan was to create a group of business people, business leaders, to sit around a table and talk about what's going on with the highest ranking members of the public sector. So to be on the Lowell plan, you have to be the chairman, president, or CEO of your company, and you can't send a rep. So we have the decision makers sitting around the table. And then you also have whoever's the city manager, whoever's the mayor, whoever's the chancellor of the university, the president of community college, et cetera, the superintendent of the national park, so that you get these people in a room, close the door on a regular basis, and talk about what's going on. So as you can imagine, those meetings don't always go well, because there's always a lot of disagreement about what's going on. But it makes both sides accountable to each other, and it opens a dialogue for people to talk that in some cases had never met each other before, and they contribute money. One of the first studies they did, and this is a history of the Lowell plan, as to what we do with the money we raise. We fund studies. And a lot of times we think these studies, and I think Peter and Diane would agree, very much are to assist the city in achieving some of its goals. But initially, whenever we approach a city manager to say we're going to hire Mount Auburn Associates to develop a cultural plan for the city, we're going to hire Jeff Speck to come in. He's a nationally known planner. We're going to hire Jeff Speck to come in and do a downtown master plan. We're going to hire the Urban Land Institute to come in and take a look at what you're doing. The initial reaction is always the same. We don't need anybody from the outside coming in telling us what to do. And we hear that all the time. And yet, the fact is, I think you need objectivity. You need somebody coming in from the outside and looking at what you're doing and finding out, are there better practices out there? Is there a better way to do things? And by doing that, after the studies are done, the city's always embraced them. The city said, oh, okay, that's good. They didn't come in and criticize us, which was never anybody's intent. So we do studies like that. We also jump-started and created a marketing program called There's a Lot to Like About Lowell. And then finally, the last point I want to touch on is we also have the ability through both agencies to buy property. Peter pointed out a large property on his before and afters called the former Bon Marché building. It was about 100,000 square feet. When that was vacated by Jordan Marsh, the concern we had was what's going to happen with this building now. We did not want it to fall into the hands. At that time, we had, well, I'm sure many of you have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, and Mr. Potter bought a lot of property there. We had a Mr. Potter here in our city. We were really afraid that Mr. Potter was going to buy that piece of property and do nothing with it until the property values would raise and he would then make money off it. So we encouraged one of the banks that had foreclosed on it to sell it to us for fairly cheap, and they did. Then what we did is we buttoned the building up, put a plan together, hired a consultant to develop a plan for the building, find tenants, which we did, and put a financing plan together. Once we did that, we didn't want to continue to own the property. Our role is to leverage development, to assist development, or in this case, to encourage something that wasn't going to happen without us. But we don't want to own property. We don't want to compete in the private sector world. We're made up of that. And so we don't want to take their place. So what we did is once we found the tenants, once we financed the building, we sold the building to get our money back. And that's all we needed to do. Probably not the best business decision we've ever made, but we got the property done. And that really was our focus. That was our goal. So we have the ability to buy property, to renovate it, to do things like that. And I think it's benefited the community as a whole. And in fact, I think as Diane knows, though I'm not sure I've told you, Peter, we're looking at another building downtown, 45 Merrimack Street, to see if there's something we couldn't do there. Needs a lot of repair, and we may have to buy that too. So I see everybody whispering around me. Am I going on way too long? Is this like a half hour after it should have been over?
It's just us whispering up here.
Oh, okay.
I'm Jim.
Because what I'd like to do now is, again, the three of us share one thing in common. We all worked at the Planning and Development Office, and we were all assistant city managers. I shouldn't say were, Diane still is. So if I could, I'd like to introduce Diane Trad, my friend, somebody that I got to work with when I was with the city and have worked since then. So Diane Trad.
Thank you very much. Well, like anything else in life, it's all about relationships, right? And I've had the good fortune to work with both Peter and Jim for many years in different capacities. I've had several jobs with the city as a design planner, a chief design planner, deputy director, and now assistant city manager. And I know, looking at these projects that we've done, I love looking back at these photos. What you don't see in the photos is all the work that went into making these projects happen, which a lot of you that work in preservation do know how much work it is. But none of this would have happened without the partnerships. We all have our levels of expertise, but without each one of us, a lot of these, and others, agencies as well, none of these projects would happen. So I think that's one of the most important things that any community or organization can do, is develop strong partnerships. We've now known each other for decades, and there's that institutional knowledge that when you have new people, they don't know anything about why certain things happen the way they did. And it's fun. We have a lot of fun working together, too. So one of the key things that I'd like to say today is that historic preservation is a priority for the city of Lowell. The preservation efforts are supported fully by the city's elected officials and the city administration. Without that, things don't go forward. So it's really important that that understanding of what the benefit and it's actually the economic development potential that these historic buildings and neighborhoods bring to the city is recognized by your city governments and your agencies. It is very important. As you saw, a lot of things came our way because of the historic resources we have in Lowell. From the city end, development and historic preservation is based in longstanding partnerships. Coordination of the development is key. And for the city of Lowell, we merged our planning and development department and what used to be called inspectional services into development services. We are now under the same umbrella. And that has made things very, very streamlined. When people come to us with big development projects, the planners can look at it. Then we get everyone from development services, talk about the zoning, talk about the building code. So a developer comes in, we don't deal with any of the finances other than if we have a federal facade grant program or something like that. But usually it's dealing with Jim's programs or private funding. But we sit down as a group and do a design review before it goes to the historic board design review, and start to point out some of the challenges of the site, of what they want to do with the building, and it's really, really helpful. It's a good resource for developers coming to the city. We'll meet as many times as they want, and we fine-tune things so that by the time it does go to the historic board, they've looked at a lot of the issues that we can deal with within the city, the zoning and whatnot. And I think that we have a very nice collaborative atmosphere in the office between the two development services and the planners, and I see Rachel back there. You can raise your hand and say, yes, they do. Yeah, but things work well, and there's a lot of people that are all on the same page, where preservation is extremely important. There are also 10 neighborhood historic districts in Lowell, and the historic board will review those projects if they are about demolition or new construction only. Anytime people want to come in and talk about their homes, they can come in and talk to Steve Soul, our historic board administrator. So it's a great resource if you have, an 1840s house and you want to know, what the trim should look like, or what colors, you'd like the house to be. Everybody's very helpful with that as well. Prior to any building permit or any permit being issued by the city, the historic board must sign off if you are in a historic district. That is critical, and that is probably the number one biggest reason for success of a lot of projects, is they start with the historic board first. And everything is flagged so that they can't go any further with permits until that approval has been gained. So that's key. Since the creation of the historic board in 1983, over 2,400 permits have been issued. That's substantial. We have made some regulatory changes in the city. We did merge, as I said. Also, we've made some zoning changes, and those have been supported by the city council and the entire administration. We have made changes that would encourage the reuse of the upper vacant floors of the downtown historic buildings. This has been a challenge, not just for Lowell, but a lot of gateway industrial communities. You've got these beautiful buildings in the downtown. The interior is outdated, maybe not up to code yet, and they sit. And in this case, is for many decades. We finally are getting some housing in those upper floors. There are people utilizing the HDIP market rate housing tax credit program, and we have a few of those going, and I think we're going to see some more. That's been helpful. We reduced the parking. It's one parking space per unit, and they can use parking garage leases as their required parking, which is important. We've also allowed minimal sizes of units. What else did we do? And there's other zoning changes that are being considered right now. We have planning documents in the city. A lot of times, people I know through the years, there have been a lot of planning documents on the shelves at DPD, but I think now we're at a stage where we actually use everything that we have to the greatest extent that we can. So in addition to individual project review, we also have a comprehensive master plan, neighborhood plans, and 3 urban renewal plans. And, it's interesting. All of the plans specifically address historic context of each of the neighborhoods, and preservation of historic properties is key. In fact, most of our urban renewal areas, the historic properties are the first ones to be renovated, which is great, and Peter and Jim have been involved in a lot of those projects. So, and if you do visit the Hamilton Canal District, you'll see the Appleton Mills and 110 Canal were the first buildings done, and then the health center. So it's great, and it draws more people in, so it is good to get those taken care of. Lowell has a master plan called Sustainability 2025, which provides a framework for development for the next decade, and many of the objectives and action items are focused on the city's historic resources. This plan is one of the primary policy tools utilized by the City Council, the Planning Board, the Zoning Board of Appeals, and the City Administration, including DPD, DPW, and other entities. Some of the objectives are as follows. Promote Lowell as a regional hub for arts, culture, and history. invest in and promote arts, historical, and cultural initiatives sustainably, actively promote the rehabilitation and reuse of remaining vacant mills and upper stories of commercial buildings in downtown Lowell in ways that will reinforce Lowell's downtown as an attractive and authentic urban neighborhood with a robust daytime and evening population, a healthy mix of residential, commercial, retail, entertainment, and recreational amenities. Increase everyday arts, historical, cultural, and recreational encounters of city residents. Educate residents and property owners about the benefits and value of historic preservation beyond the boundaries of the national park as a catalyst for neighborhood preservation and revitalization. Another key, educating people, which, we've been very fortunate. We have a National Historic Park right in our city, so people can go to museums and learn that way. I know that's not typical of a lot of communities. Support the National Historical Park's expanding vision to serve the city as a whole, including continued collaborations with the Lowell Public Schools so that all elementary school children have an opportunity to learn about the city's history and heritage. Seek funding to provide historic preservation loans and other benefits for preservation, and say preservation 100 times, it's not easy, for historic dwellings located in historic districts. Preserve historic landscapes. My background is landscape design, so these were very important to me when I was a design planner. So we've done restoration work at South Common, Tyler Park, Fort Hill Park, historic mill yards and other green spaces, the canalways. These have been restored where possible to reflect the original design intent. And the city was awarded landscape preservation grants years ago for some of those projects. So the state is, as you know, involved in some of those things. Work to restore connections and break up larger city blocks into smaller, better networked, walkable street grids where historic pattern has been lost. Another step that our transportation planners look at, which is important. I won't read all of them, trust me, I'm not going to go on for 100 pages. Support efforts to expand Lowell historic preservation initiatives, protect historic cemeteries, expand historical and architectural walking tour offerings. Over the last year or two, we've had a very successful Lowell Walks program that is run by Dick Howe, and then other people will come in and speak. It's very interesting. There have been talks about the historic districts, Hamilton Canal, Canalways, I can't remember any of the others, Peter, can you? Underground.
Some of them are about historical characters in Lowell's past,
Yeah.
but some of them focus on redevelopment and the physical resources.
Yeah, and they've had over 100 people every Saturday per walk, which is really exciting. And sometimes they're just from Lowell, other times they're from the surrounding area, but people have loved them. They've been really successful. So if you get the chance sometime, look online and you can find out what's happening. Oh, by the way, our master plan is online, and all the other documents that I'm referring to can be found online as well.
Where?
At thecityoflowell.org. Is that it?
Lowell MA?
LowellMA. I never look it up that way, so it goes, when I open my computer, it's there. Showcase exemplary projects which illustrate sustainable building practices and historic preservation. The Better Building program that Jim referred to was a $5 million program that the city applied for the grant through the Department of Energy, and it was specifically targeting historic buildings in the downtown, and they had not seen a program like that before. So we, as you know, a lot of the historic buildings are more costly to renovate, so people would ignore doing sustainable improvements to their properties for heating and whatnot. So that was very successful, and we came out of it, we did 31 or 32 projects, and one of the things that we found was that it really isn't that much different than dealing with a newer building. I think people have fears about doing it. There are solutions. I mean, there are different ways you have to do things a lot, but in the end, it worked out very well. People were very happy with that program. Maintain cultural and historic venues as safe and welcoming gathering spaces. So now we come to the Hamilton Canal District, and this is a 13-acre site, now known as the Hamilton Canal Innovation District, and it was envisioned with the following goals: to develop an extension of downtown Lowell, link the Gallagher Terminal to downtown, create a signature development at the gateway of downtown, develop a mixed-use urban environment, support and encourage pedestrian activity, stimulate an active street presence, capitalize on historic canals, and when you see the picture, you already did once, there's a lot of historic canalways there, and it makes it a very, very special place. Implement green building and sustainable development practices, and increase the employment base and tax revenues. And that master plan can be found online, too. The development model was that the city assembled the parcels. We solicited for a master developer, and that was Trinity Financial that Peter mentioned. They are no longer our master developer, but we have an RFQ out right now. If you know a master developer, send them our way. But the city is working with many developers for individual parcels at this time, and we're in the process of trying to sign a land disposition agreement with many of them. We have expedited permitting in the Hamilton Canal, site preparation on the southern side of the Hamilton Canal. The canal itself is already in place, so they're pad ready to go. And this is truly a public-private partnership. There's a lot of state and federal funding that went into this project, and then a lot of private development as well. Probably the most different aspect of this project was the way it got started through a public visioning process. And these meetings were a huge success, very well attended. It was a 9-month process that began in 2007. We engaged potential stakeholders to develop a realistic consensus vision for the project. The teams included architects, planners, engineers, finance professionals, as well as trained facilitators. There were several meetings, and the master plan for the development included placement, use, massing, and character of the buildings, location and designs for open spaces and infrastructure, a realistic financial model to implement the project, extensive set of drawings and models that could be readily understood. So this is the master plan actually for that Hamilton Canal District. It's really interesting. There's a form-based code there so that the scale and mass of the building is dictated through the code. And we worked very carefully with the Park Service, with all of our partners on that plan.
And the only permit that's required, so everything's pre-permitted if you comply with the size and scale and shape of the buildings. One permit you still need is historic board.
That's right.
For what the design of the building, the shell of the building will look like.
That's right.
So, and thank you to the city for making that a priority, so.
Yeah. And, there's a misinterpretation that because the historic board is going to be involved, sometimes people think that we're going to ask you to replicate a historic building. That's not the case. It's contemporary, but needs to fit in with the scale of the neighborhood and the existing historic buildings. Just like the Tremont Yard building that you showed with the metal and glass. It just has to fit properly. In the next several months, if you do head out that way, you will see the steel is up for the Justice Center that DCAM is building, which is going to be 7 stories, 240,000 square feet, I think, 240 million. They're both about the same. It's an expensive building. And other things will be happening there as well. On the northern side of the Hamilton Canal, the city will be putting out to bid all of the infrastructure for that northern piece, which is right now, it's just, you don't see anything. Do you want to point for me? Vanna?
I'll do Vanna White. So the infrastructure coming in from here into here, let's see,
Yep.
this way.
And then right over
and
the
And then
bridge.
across, putting in
Yep.
the new bridge.
Yep.
That will go across the canal over there.
Right.
And, we have the
Parking
little
garage.
parking
Yep, we're in the
project,
process of
which-
designing a 980 car parking garage. So we'll put all the infrastructure in the streets, sidewalks, lighting, utilities, and the garage will be in by 2020. That project will be going out to bid in the next month or so. So we're very excited. That grant was funded through 4.7 through a MassWorks grant for the roadways, and then we found an EDA grant for the bridge, and they needed us to match it, so we combined the two. So we got EDA to pay for it, and MassWorks, and of course, we did end up paying something, but very little compared to what we got in funding. So this was a really, really great project, and it will transform this area, because right now, those buildings don't exist, and it's just a dirt lot. So I think when people start to see that, there'll be a lot of interest in developing those parcels. We have another initiative that's not city-run. It's the Waterways Vitality Initiative. And during this past year, this vision for the city waterways has emerged through the Lowell Heritage Partnership. And I don't know if any of you are from Lowell and seen some of these things happening, but lighting up canals, they're going to be doing all kinds of really interesting artistic treatment of cultural resources with light. The city has lit one of the canals along Lucy Larkin Park, and just breathing new life into spaces, and the lighting is really special. So keep your eyes out for that. I think that's about it. A lot going on. In the next 2 years from now to 2020, there will be a lot happening in Lowell. New roadways, the Lord Overpass is going to be completely redone, Hamilton Canal, the garage. There's a lot happening. The Justice Center will be completed in 2020. We do have several developers looking at parcels here, and their timeline is such that they're looking at 2020 as well. So if you're not in Lowell all the time and you come back in a few years, you're going to see some big changes.